Okay, in this lesson we're going to look at our final topic for the year, and this is a quick introduction to it. We're going to look at graphing the sine and cosine functions. So graphing sinusoidal functions. So if you set your calculator to radian mode and calculate what the sine of 0 is, uh, you can fill in the tables of values here and calculate the sine of pi over 2. So if you like, press pause and do this for both sine of x and cosine of x, filling in the table of values for 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi radians. Once you've done that, you'll see you'll get these same values. And you might also get these just by reading them off of your unit circle, recognizing that when x is pi over 2, or when theta in this case on the unit circle is pi over 2, the value of the cosine is the x value, which is 0, -1, 0, and 1. These two tables of values are really important to memorize, and it'll be easier to memorize when you think of what they look like as well. So take your calculator now and switch it, make sure that you're in degrees mode, and click on the window button and set your window for this. So our x's are going to go from -180 to 720 degrees in steps of 90, and then our y values will go from -3 to +3 in steps of 1. Such a blank graph looks like this. Then press your y equals button, and then let's enter the sine of x and take a look at um, the sine function. So when I do that and press graph, I get this beautiful wavy function, which is called a sinusoidal function. It keeps repeating itself, which means it's periodic. Okay, and a periodic function repeats itself continually, and we're going to define some of the um, characteristics of this graph. Notice as you compare this to your table of values, and we're just talking the sine x, it starts at 0 and then moves up to 1, down to 0, down to -1, and back up to 0 again. Okay, so I'm going to just switch to the next page here and we can sketch in that function. Okay, so the part that we did was that we sketched in that table of values was one cycle of the function 0, 0, pi over 2, and 1, pi and 0, 3 pi over 2, and -1, and 2 pi and 0. So our function goes like this. But by sketching it on the graphing calculators, we recognize that it continues in both directions and continues to repeat itself. So let's take a look at some of the characteristics of this. The amplitude of a periodic function. The amplitude is the distance from the center of a function to its highest point, or from the center to its lowest point, which is equal, okay? So there's our amplitude. I'll put a little 1 here and a 1 there to show what the amplitude. So the amplitude of this function is equal to 1. The sinusoidal axis is the horizontal line that runs through the center of the graph. As you can imagine, once we start doing vertical translations, the sinusoidal axis will change because the x-axis will no longer be in the center of that graph. But in this case, the sinusoidal axis is y equals 0, which is the x-axis. The third thing we want to look at is the period. And the period is the length of the cycle. So this graph starts repeating itself If we think of the cycle, we're going up, down, and then up again, and it repeats, starts to repeat here. So the period is 2 pi or 360 degrees. Okay, and then it repeats itself exactly every 360 degrees or every 2 pi radians. Okay, let's go back and think about domain and range. The domain of the function, so all the possible x values, really runs from negative infinity to infinity. The range, however, is, if you look at the graph, really just runs from -1 to +1. And we'll use square brackets because we're including the endpoints. Okay, now it's really important to remember the table of values for each of these. So find some way in which to remember it. If you remember the shape of the sinusoidal, you'll see that it's sort of S-shaped. It starts in the middle, so it starts at 0, increases to 1, goes back to 0, -1, and back to 0 again. Okay, and now let's take a look at the cosine curve. I'm going to bring up the calculator again, and I'm going to leave my window values the same, but instead of the sine of x, I'm going to have the cosine of x. And hit graph, and you'll see that it's almost the same, but slightly different, just like the table of values. The cosine of x starts at the 1 instead of starting at the 0. So if this is 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. We start at the highest point, come to 0, go to our lowest point, come to 0, and come up to the highest point. And because of the graphing calculator, we recognize it also continues. It's also periodic, and it's also considered a sinusoidal curve. Okay? So let's take a look at the characteristics of the cosine curve. Okay, so our amplitude is still equal to 1. The peak, the highest point of the graph, is still, the distance from that to the midpoint is still 1. Okay, the sinusoidal axis is still y equals 0. The x-axis still runs horizontally through the middle of that graph. The period, or length of the cycle, but we're going to use the term period here, again is 2 pi radians or 360 degrees. The domain and range are exactly the same. The domain, the x values can go as high or as low as we want, and the range is -1 to +1. Okay, and again, try to memorize that table of values in both radians and degrees so that you're comfortable with that. And in the next lesson, we're going to start looking at transformations of those two basic graphs.